Welcome to Letters to Myself. In today's session, we will be focusing on the silenced voice. We are hosting this episode with our hosts Mariah as Elizabeth Lavenza, Ariana as Henry Clerval, and Zine as Victor Frankenstein.
Not the tenderness of friendship, nor the beauty of the earth, nor of heaven, could redeem my soul from woe. The very accents of love were ineffectual. I was encompassed by a cloud which no beneficial influence could penetrate. Shelby, 81.
In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the author despairingly incorporates the motivations and actions of vital characters, Elizabeth, Henry, and Victor, in order to demonstrate how isolation creates barriers within relationships.
Mariah Eichbaum start Letters to Myself. The Chronicles of Frankenstein's Bride, Elizabeth Valencia.
Hello, welcome to Letters to Myself. Could you please state your name and cause of death?
Hello, my name is Elizabeth. My cause of death was dying at the hands of my new husband, Victor Frankenstein's creation, on my wedding night.
I'm so sorry about that, Elizabeth. Truly. Now that we're on the topic of feelings of loneliness and isolation, I want to ask you how you experienced it as well.
Well, since very young age, I was always lonely. Since my parents passing and later on being adopted into the Frankenstein family because they've known my family for a long time. Although I was considered their niece and cousin too, they treated me like a daughter.
Although having a hardship at a young age and experiencing loneliness at a young age, as you stated, were you not happy by being adopted by the Frankensteins and having a sense of a normal life?
Of course I was happy, but it was something new. I was loved and embraced very generously, but I feel I didn't start experiencing loneliness until after Caroline died.
What happened after her death that made you feel that way?
I was kind of alone and had to take on a maternal role and push aside my feelings to take care of my family as they did for me. Continuing to grow my relationships further as a daughter and soon to be lover of Victor's.
Did you ever feel isolated or lonely when you were with Victor?
In the beginning, no, but then towards his time in Switzerland to pursue his career, yes, as I lettered him every day, waiting to visit him, but each day there was nothing in return that I received on Victor's end. It made me feel isolated and drove me to sadness and depression. Returned to Geneva, that I was grateful to see his face again and finally be at peace, that he indeed was still in love with me.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing your story and feelings. One more question to end this off. Do you think your feelings can be related to others surrounding the Frankensteins as well? And if you could write a letter to oneself, what would you say?
Of course, loneliness is everywhere and at everyone's disposal, no matter the cost and end. And I believe personally that everyone has their own sense of isolation and can relate it back to loneliness, just as I did, making us all alone together. Elizabeth's anxiety and empathy is what broke her in the end. When I saw you, Autumn, so unhappy, flying to solitude from the society of every creature, I cannot help supposing you would regret our connection. Shelby 178. Do you not love another? Shelby 178. Letter. Mariah Eichbaum. Letters to Myself, Segment 1, Elizabeth Lavenza, end.
Segment 2, Henry Clerval. Letters to Myself from You to Me.
Welcome to Letters to Myself. Please introduce yourself to us and our audience.
Hello, thank you for having me. I am Henry Clerval. I am the son of a Genevan merchant as well as a very good friend of Victor Frankenstein and his family.
It's great to have you, Henry. Please tell us about your relationship with Victor. How did you feel seeing the state that Victor was in during your arrival to Ingolstadt? What were you thinking or feeling at the time, and what was it like to care for Victor?
Victor and I are childhood and lifelong friends. We met in school as children, in which I used to make him act in plays and enter into masquerades with me, as I loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. When I arrived in Ingolstadt, I was horrified by how ill Victor appeared. So thin and pale, he looked as if he had been watching for several nights. Victor had a glimpse of madness in his eyes. He displayed this deep terror and anguish, as if someone had placed a bounty on his life. In my deepest fantasies of knighthood and chivalry, I was a hero, and yet I couldn't protect my dearest friend from the pain that oppressed him. So I took on the burden of isolation alongside him. I could not seek the support of Victor's family, as I knew they would be worried but were unfit to travel. Thus, Victor remained trapped and alone in his own mind, as I, unaccompanied, nursed him from his suffering. According to Julian Holtz, a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University, social isolation and loneliness significantly increase the risk for premature mortality, and the magnitude of the risk exceeds that of many leading health indicators, in which the indicators include chain smoking, alcohol abuse, and obesity. I watched as Victor took on this social isolation that caused him to hold on to this hindrance that led him to deteriorate mentally and physically, and even though I was his most sincere friend, he could not bear to share his burden with me. Even at Victor's side, I was alone and helpless.
Why did you not go to Ingolstadt earlier or follow Victor off to college?
My father was a narrow-minded trader who saw my desire to attend university as idleness and ruin to my aspirations and ambition. He saw fit that I would succeed his business. However, I had no desire to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. I wanted to extend my education as I sought something greater for myself. I had dreams of glory I wished to fulfill, in which I wouldn't be able to achieve being a simple merchant. I had also feared and worried for Victor as he was alone in a foreign place. My fears were correct. In that time, I was alone from my greatest friend and forced to live a life I did not want. Eventually, after great persuasion, my father's affection for me at great length overcame his dislike of learning, and he had permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to the land of knowledge, for which I am grateful.
Prior to your death, you traveled with Victor throughout Europe. What was it like?
I accompanied Victor on his journey at the request of Elizabeth, as we all feared for Victor's well-being, especially following the death of William, Victor's youngest brother. Although I initially joined Victor to keep him company, I found that this journey provided me with means of expressing my own endeavors. On my way to meet Victor in Strasbourg, I developed a love and excitement for the beauties of nature. Even in my own seclusion, I felt as if this is what it is to live. Despite experiencing the nature of my home country, nothing could compare to the landscape surrounding the Rhine, in which I felt I had been transported to fairyland and enjoyed a happiness seldom tasted by man. Being alone in nature provided a tranquility that I had longed to experience and opened up a new world for me to enjoy. And once Victor and I arrived in England, I realized the nation provided me with opportunities to achieve the life I had always wanted. By studying Oriental languages, I was also pursuing an object I had long had in view. I wished to visit India and, with my knowledge of languages, provide the means of maternally assisting the progress of European colonization and trade. I felt as if I was on the brink of fulfilling my childhood dream of becoming one among those whose names are recorded in story. I was in seclusion from my family, home, and Victor, who left for Scotland to fulfill his own endeavors, and yet I was away from all that comforted me. I felt as if I had truly found my place.
We understand that this might be a sensitive subject, but if you don't mind us asking, what were your final moments like? Please describe it for us. What was going through your mind in these final moments?
At the time of my death, I had my future planned, and I was on the brink of achieving the glory I had always wanted. I had received many letters from the acquaintances I formed in London, in which they sought my return to complete the negotiations they had entered into for my Indian enterprise. My destiny was ahead of me. I could not any longer delay my departure, and yet I could not leave Victor alone in his solitude. I wished to respect his wishes of being alone, but I knew how social isolation took a toll on him, and I never wished to see him in that horrid state again. Thus, I wrote him a letter informing him of my plans and encouraging him to join me. I asked that he leave his solitary isle and to meet him at Perth so that we might proceed together. Upon sending the letter, I made my way to Perth, and on one odd night I was attacked by this appalling creature. It had caught me by surprise and gripped me by the throat. The beast was tall in stature with bright yellow eyes, and no matter how hard I fought, its strength overpowered me. As I began to lose consciousness, the thought of Victor ran across my mind. I believed that Victor would be traveling to Perth as well, which meant this creature may also take his life.
I wish for him to be safe, as he had suffered enough, especially after the death of his mother, William, and the mental burden he always carried. Victor did not deserve a fate like this. Before I knew it, I was overtaken with darkness, and that is the last moment I can remember.
Thank you for sharing. We are so sorry that happened to you. We have one last question. If you could write a letter to your younger self, what would you tell him?
Dear Henry, Victor and I each felt that it was necessary to fulfill our goals even at the expense of others. Even though I believed that, I never followed through, as I always prioritized Victor or my father above myself. And that is one of my biggest regrets that I in my grave will bear alone. Never regret nor forget the care that you provide to those you love. You are a gentle and loving person, and that is your greatest attribute. However, do not give your love away at the expense of yourself. Henry, you are more capable than you ever dreamed you could be. Do not isolate yourself from others, but seek the opportunities that seclude you from comfort, because you will thrive and become the glorious adventurer you always sought to be. Lastly, find your place in nature and be happiest with yourself above all. Good luck, and thank you. Segment 2, Henry Clerval, end.
3. Zing Wen as Victor Frankenstein. Inside the mind of the mad scientist Victor Frankenstein.
Hello, Victor. Welcome to Letters to Myself. I've had the chance to speak with your friends Henry and Elizabeth, but for our listeners who might not know who you are, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Victor Frankenstein, and I'm the main character of Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein. Many may know me as a mad scientist who went crazy and made a creature that terrorized my family, but my close friends and family would say that I'm rather ambivalent, calm, and loved few, but the few I did love, I cherished deeply.
Now to start, I don't want to overwhelm you and I cannot imagine the pain of your loss. Could you tell me a little about your relationship with Miss Lavenza and Mr. Clerval?
Yes, Elizabeth was an angel, a blessing to my family. I was 4 years old when I first met her. Her mother had died, and my mother, ever so loving and fond of Elizabeth, adopted her into the family. She was a promised gift to me from my mother, and I viewed her as my own, mine to protect, love, and cherish. Elizabeth was a living spirit of love, and she was loved by everyone she came across. She, like myself, also loved to read, but she had these celestial eyes, and she remained filial and pure. Elizabeth was truly like no other, and William's death, coupled with Justine's death sentence for her false charges as a murderer, truly broke her poor heart. Sweet Elizabeth did not deserve to die that night. I had thought the monster would come after me, not her, not my Elizabeth.
What about Henry Clerval?
Well, Henry and I were childhood best friends. While my family came from a lineage of syndics, his came from a family of merchants. Nonetheless, we were boys and we grew even fonder of each other as we grew older, and it wasn't hard for my family to accept him as another son. He was full of kindness and generous with a passion for adventure. Henry was a bright man with the greatest imagination. He was a genius like me, and I admired him. He had this thirst for knowledge and literature, moral relations of things, the busy stages of life, the virtues of heroes, and as kind as he was, Henry was ambitious with his dreams to become one among those whose names were recorded in history. Henry never left my side. He nursed me back to health without knowing why I was so ill, and he didn't even ask questions about my integrity. No one did. But Henry came with me to Europe on his own mission, and yet I ended it when the creature killed him. My best friend. Oh. My poor friend. Grief and illness for 2 months until I turned to Geneva.
There's also another person I'd like to get to know your relationship with, Mr. Walton. I ask this because, what about Robert Walton? Was it that made you comfortable enough to open up your secrets that even your best friend did not love?
Robert reminded me of myself. He had the same craze in his eyes and ambition. His ambition stood out to me, reminding me of Henry, yet I found him similar, a little too similar to me. As I told him my story, I was able to release my burden of forbidden knowledge, but even then I knew not to tell Robert the secret of life. Robert was an opportunity for me to finish this cursed chase, and I knew I wouldn't make it long on the boat. Death was catching up, and Robert was the only person left whom I could relinquish my task to.
What was the task?
To kill that creature.
Now, you had multiple encounters with your creature. Why didn't you kill him then? For instance, at the summit of Mount Montevent?
amount of it to be alone. From Elizabeth, my father, and Henry, I was losing control of myself. I could not sleep, could not breathe, or let a thought pass without the reminder of what that monster had done. I went there to rest my mind, and as I did, the breeze in the wilderness in that vast land, alone and finally at peace, I could close my eyes and sleep. Yet that monster came. I raged and I was ready to attack, but he pleaded to me, and for a split second I did feel compassion for him. His loneliness, or rather isolation from the rest of humanity, I could understand it. Then he offered me a deal that would solve my problem. It was a deal that would lead to the death of my two closest persons.
Victor, I get the sense that you have a magnetic draw to isolation, such as when you deliberately made the creature in the lab, as you called it, was in a solitary chamber, or rather a cell, at the top of the house, by Shelley, 52, and traveling to the mountain alone amidst the creature free reign. What exactly about isolation draws you to it?
Reading Agrippa, watching that charred tree, creating the monster to chasing him, there was this unavailing excitement that I had come to the greatest scientific discovery. I alone had found the secret of life, which in those times was ludicrous, and the pleasure of getting close to this saintly discovery I couldn't get in my innate domain around Henry or Elizabeth, and I couldn't have told them either. I mean, what would they think of me? During those joyful times, I was ambitious, and isolation was my closest companion that aided me. However, it was also creating fear after that thing came to life. I couldn't turn to my friends and family now. I couldn't expose them to any more dangers. This riveting fear, I must absent myself from peace and happiness. I alone carried the burden of the guilt that no one knew of, and that brought me a sense of peace among all the madness.
Isolation was as much as a curse as it was a companion to you. When did that switch turn? How did your relationship with isolation change?
I would have these almost manic episodes. I couldn't think of anything except for my fear and anxiety of it. The creature, well, was everywhere just as he watched me from the window in Ingolstadt. Henry's death created rivets across my body. During those months of illness, I had compulsions, or rather than feeling peace and isolation alone, when my father came from Geneva, I felt this longing joy to see him and finally go back home. However, my fears turned into monomania. The creature was going to find me and kill me, but it was Elizabeth who died. The creature didn't stop there. Not long after my father passed, with heartache and grief, I was alone, pitifully alone, with the murderous creature stalking me. So you ask how my relationship with isolation changed? Well, not much. I couldn't physically tear myself away from isolation when I realized how much I had barricaded myself from my family and Victor. I was no longer scared of death. I was alone now, and I couldn't escape from my isolation. I wanted to be free from my choice of isolation, but it was too late then. Everyone was dead. I had to chase that monster. Solitude makes us monsters of both. The emptiness that came with the loss of my family and Henry was filled with rage and unquelled anger to destroy that monster, as now my wanderings began, which are to cease but with life. And it was only revenge that kept me alive. I dared not die and leave my adversary in being again.
Now, I've realized that amidst all the chaotic events that conspired, you tend to go into say, depressive, almost maniac episodes. And you have these triggers of stress, anxiety, lack of sleep, and of course the dramatic changes to your life. As researcher Lorenzo Latti wrote in Mania and Bipolar Disorder, What to Know, for Medica News today, mania and bipolar disorder cause high energy levels and may come with euphoria or agitation. These symptoms include a reduced need for sleep, racing thoughts, and restlessness. Can I ask your thoughts on the topic of this subject?
Yes, well, I had to struggle with monomania from when I was creating the creature. My obsessive fixation, along with my persecutory delusions, would mix in, deterring me from reality and isolating me from the people closest to me. On the matter of bipolar disorder, I often found myself easily angry, especially towards my creation, and I would always fall into depressive episodes afterwards. It was uncontrollable, which many people who suffer and have to live with bipolar disorder know most well. At one moment you're fine, and the next this wave of anguish, anger, and sadness looms over you, and you are also tranced by it, distancing yourself and even destroying bonds with your loved ones, which, as the same as Lorenzo Lucetti wrote in Mania and Bipolar Disorder, What to Know for Medical News History, treatment involves a combination of talk therapy and medications.
How much of this illness do you constitute to your creation gone wrong?
I did suffer from my struggles with mental health, and although they catapulted some of the decisions I made, I do not blame them as the sole cause for them. But I understood the gravity of mental health going unchecked, and I advise children and young adults who are most apt to be permanently affected in their later developmental years to not be afraid to embrace it and seek treatment for it.
Now, as we enter the last minutes of our segment, I want to talk about your final moment. You were trapped in the Arctic Sea. What was going through your head in those moments?
It was desolate, so cold like life had never touched it before. We were trapped in ice, and my health was deteriorating. I was so bitterly alone in that sea of ice. I could now only leave it to Walton to kill the creature.
Now, Victor, my last question before I let you off. If you could write a letter to past Victor, when and what would you write? It could be anything from advice to a warning.
Dear Victor Frankenstein, do not run until it is too late. Do not let fear take reign. Do not let the monster take your family and Henry. Do not hide in isolation when the seas turn fervent. You could not have known what future events would conspire, but do not fret. Come to your senses. Go to Henry before the monster kills him, and stay with Elizabeth until the night is over. Do not dwell in solitude. Solitude makes us monsters of both. Seek the opportunity to love and cherish your family and Henry. Do not do it alone once more until death gives you no other choice but to do it by yourself, all alone.
Thank you, Victor. I am glad to hear your story, and you have my condolences.
Segment 3, end.
Pray your loneliness may spur you into finding something to live for, great enough to die for. Dag Harmonshold. Thank you for listening to Letters to Myself. Learn from our mistakes and seek a life surrounded by those you love. Thank you.